On a freezing night in March of 1867, while most of Washington slept beneath a sky the color of gunmetal, a single lamp burned in the office of Secretary of State William H. Seward. The war had ended, but peace had not yet settled into the bones of the nation. The United States was stitched together with grief and stubborn hope. President Lincoln was dead, Reconstruction was fragile, and the country's treasury groaned under debt. Yet in that quiet room, Seward leaned over a map of a distant, frozen wilderness and prepared to gamble what little political capital remained to him. Russia wanted to sell Alaska. To most Americans, it was an absurd proposition. The newspapers had already sharpened their knives. They called it Seward's Folly, Seward's Icebox, and Johnson's Polar Bear Garden. $7.2 million for a land of snow and darkness? A place few could find on a globe? The nation had just survived the bloodiest conflict in its history, and now its Secretary of State wanted to buy a frozen desert from a fading empire? But Seward saw something others did not. Russia, weakened after the Crimean War, feared losing Alaska to Britain in another conflict. British Canada pressed from the east. The Pacific was becoming a theater of trade and ambition. China and Japan, long closed, were beginning to open. Steamships were shrinking oceans. The world was tilting westward, toward the Pacific Rim. Alaska was not empty. It was a doorway.
Negotiations stretched late into the night with Russian Minister Eduard de Stokel. Papers shuffled, numbers whispered, ink scratched across parchment. At 4 a.m. on March 30th, 1867, the treaty was signed. The United States had agreed to purchase 586,000 square miles of territory for $7.2 million, about 2 cents an acre. When the news broke, laughter echoed through Congress. Editorial cartoons showed polar bears roaming the Senate chamber. Critics thundered that Seward had lost his mind. The country needed railroads, schools, reconciliation, not glaciers. Yet Seward pressed forward, lobbying senators relentlessly. He spoke of naval power, of trade routes, of destiny stretching from Atlantic to Pacific and beyond. On April 9th, 1867, the Senate ratified the treaty by a vote of 37-2. America had expanded again, though few believed it mattered. The transfer ceremony in October was awkward and wind-bitten. In Sitka, Russian soldiers lowered their flag. American troops raised theirs. Accounts say the Russian flag became tangled and had to be torn down, an awkward omen. Cannons boomed. The land changed hands without a shot fired. For years, Alaska seemed to confirm every insult. It remained remote, harsh, barely governed. The Army administered it indifferently. Settlers were scarce. The winters were merciless. Washington largely forgot it existed. But beneath the permafrost, history was patient. In 1896, gold was discovered in the Klondike region near the Alaskan border. Within months, rumors exploded into headlines. By 1898, tens of thousands of prospectors surged north in one of the most dramatic migrations in American history. They came from Seattle, San Francisco, New York. They came from farms and factories. They climbed the Chilkoot Pass carrying a year's worth of supplies on their backs, each man hauling nearly a ton of goods in brutal relays up icy slopes. Many found nothing but frostbite and disappointment. Some struck fortunes that transformed cities. Seattle boomed into a gateway metropolis almost overnight, branding itself as the outfitter
to the Klondike. Railroads expanded, steamship companies thrived. Newspapers that once mocked the purchase now praised its promise. Gold poured out of the north, millions of dollars worth. Seward had been dead for decades, but his gamble began to shimmer with vindication. Yet gold was only the beginning. Alaska's fisheries became some of the richest in the world. Salmon canneries lined the coasts. Timber and copper followed. Still, the territory remained sparsely populated. Rugged and half understood by the mainland public. Then came war.
In 1942, months after Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces invaded and occupied two Aleutian islands, Attu and Kiska. It was the only time since the War of 1812 that foreign troops held American soil. Suddenly, Alaska was not a distant curiosity, but a strategic shield. Airfields sprang up across the territory. Soldiers trained in Arctic survival. The harsh landscape turned into a defensive frontier protecting the West Coast. Military planners realized what Seward had intuited. Alaska was a bridge between continents. During World War II, American aircraft flew from Alaska to Siberia under the Lend-Lease program, delivering vital supplies to the Soviet Union. The Arctic sky became a corridor of alliance. When the Cold War began, Alaska's importance deepened. Radar stations dotted the tundra. Early warning systems scanned for Soviet missiles. Submarines prowled icy waters. Anchorage grew. Bases expanded. The once mocked icebox became a cornerstone of national security. And then, in 1968, came the discovery that changed everything. Oil. At Prudhoe Bay, beneath layers of frozen earth, geologists uncovered one of the largest oil fields in North America. The announcement rippled across global markets. Skeptics fell silent. Engineers faced a monumental challenge: how to move oil across 800 miles of wilderness to an ice-free port. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline System was born. Completed in 1977, it stretched like a steel artery across mountains, rivers, and permafrost. It was one of the most ambitious engineering projects in American
History. At its peak, it carried over 2 million barrels of oil per day. Revenue surged. The state of Alaska, which achieved statehood in 1959, established a permanent fund in 1976, investing oil revenues for future generations. Residents began receiving annual dividend checks, direct payments drawn from resource wealth. It was an unprecedented economic experiment in shared prosperity. By the late 20th century, the $7.2 million investment had generated hundreds of billions of dollars in economic output. Energy security, jobs, infrastructure, global leverage, all traced back to that sleepless night in 1867. But Alaska's story is not merely one of American triumph. Long before Russians arrived in the 18th century, indigenous peoples had thrived there for thousands of years. The Inuit, Yupik, Tlingit, Haida, Athabaskan, and others built complex societies adapted to one of the harshest climates on Earth. They navigated icy waters with unmatched skill, developed rich spiritual traditions, and sustained trade networks across vast distances. The American purchase altered their world profoundly. Diseases spread. Missionaries and boarding schools suppressed languages and traditions. Land rights were ignored. Generations endured cultural erosion and economic hardship. In 1971,
After years of activism and negotiation, Congress passed the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, granting 44 million acres of land and nearly $1 billion to Native corporations. It was one of the largest land settlements in U.S. history, reshaping the relationship between indigenous communities and the federal government. The law did not erase the past, but it marked a shift toward recognition and restitution. As the 21st century unfolds, Alaska stands again at the center of global attention. Climate change is melting Arctic sea ice at unprecedented rates. New shipping lanes are emerging, shortening trade routes between Asia, Europe, and North America. Nations including Russia and China are investing heavily in Arctic strategy. Military planners revisit maps that Seward once studied by lamplight. Oil fields mature. Renewable energy debates intensify. Indigenous voices grow stronger in shaping policy. The wilderness remains vast, glaciers towering and rivers untamed, but the geopolitical stakes are rising once more. Looking back,
It is astonishing how narrowly history can pivot. Had the Senate rejected the treaty, Alaska might have remained Russian until revolution consumed that empire in 1917. It might have fallen under British influence, altering the map of North America. During the Cold War, a hostile power could have stood just miles from Canada and the continental United States. Instead, a ridiculed Secretary of State wagered on ice and distance and won. Americans often celebrate boldness in hindsight. The Louisiana Purchase once faced criticism. So did the acquisition of California. Expansion has always stirred controversy, ambition tangled with uncertainty. But Alaska remains one of the clearest examples of strategic foresight turning mockery into mastery. Today, tourists photograph glaciers calving into turquoise waters, fishermen hauling salmon beneath endless summer light, oil pumps nod rhythmically against Arctic horizons, fighter jets patrol northern skies. In classrooms, children learn about Seward's Folly with a smile.
Aware that folly turned into fortune. History rarely announces its turning points. They happen in quiet rooms, in ink strokes at 4 a.m, in decisions that seem irrational to contemporaries. Only decades later does their magnitude emerge. On that cold March night, William H. Seward was not buying snow. He was buying time, leverage, possibility. He was buying access to oceans and resources and future trade routes not yet imagined. He was, in a sense, buying the next century. And America, though it did not realize it then, would end up buying Alaska twice, first with money and later with belief.